I am Sarah Ortiz Shields. Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here tonight. We're going to have a discussion about elections, and I hope you all have a lot of questions because I have a lot of questions. I run Austin Tech Alliance. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit here in Austin, and our mission is to get Austin's tech sector civically engaged. So I'm really excited that you're here. May is our membership month. If you join ATA during May, we have some pretty good prizes, like free co-working spots, a chocolate tasting, scooter rides, Lyft rides, Uber rides, some online classes. So if anybody is interested in joining ATA, it's $25 a month. We are a nonprofit, so we are funded by your donations and your membership. So if you have any questions about joining, please grab me. I'll be wandering around, and I'll be here all night. So thank you for being here. I would like to welcome James Slattery. James is the senior voting rights attorney with the Texas Civil Rights Project. And this is going to be really informal. So he's going to sort of give a recap and then talk to us about what's going on right now. And at the end, we will have a Q&A, and I'll walk around with the mic, and you guys can ask your questions. We're also live streaming, so you can tell your friends that didn't make it to tune into our live stream, and that would be rad. So thank you for being here. I'm really excited to see people turn out to hear about our elections and our voting process. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, everyone. I feel like I'm doing stand-up, except I'm sitting down. So thanks for coming. So to give you all a little bit of background about where I come from and what my organization does, I'm a senior staff attorney in the voting rights program at the Texas Civil Rights Project. So our program does all kinds of work on voting rights. I'll get to that in a second, but I came to this very not straight-wise. So I'd always wanted to go to work in government, work in campaigns, work in public policy. Like, I think I watched way too much of Law and Order and The West Wing growing up. And so I went to law school, I think wanting to do good in the world, but not quite knowing how to do that. And so I wound up practicing law for a while after that. And actually a scene from The West Wing that has always spoken to me is, I think it's the beginning of season 2 when we find out how each of the characters gets onto this presidential campaign that no one thinks has a shot in hell. And I remember Sam Seaborn, who is the Rob Lowe character, I think. He is working at a law firm, and he's negotiating like an oil tanker sale or something, and just hating his life and being like, man, is this really like what I was meant to do in life? And so I sort of felt that way at the law firm. But then I got a job on the Obama campaign. A secret to getting hired on a political campaign, or maybe in any organization, is to volunteer to do it for free, which is what I did. And so I worked on their ballot access program, basically making sure that the campaign complied with the laws required to get on the ballot in all 50 states, plus the District of Columbia. And then through that, my introduction to voting rights was really, we helped prepare for a recount if we ever wound up in a situation like in 2000, where we were fighting a recount in one or more states. And that was really my first time learning about this thing that I thought I knew and cared about, which was the right to vote. And I guess I thought the right to vote was a lot about Jim Crow and the civil rights struggle and the Voting Rights Act. And it is that, but it's not as in the past as we like to think it is. And in fact, it is still, I don't want to say manipulated, but influenced by election laws that may appear neutral when you first read them, but then when you come to understand what their effects are on real people, you realize that some laws will disenfranchise voters and are intended to disenfranchise voters even if they are cloaked in neutral language. So after that, I worked on a series of political campaigns, including my introduction to Texas, which was the Wendy Davis campaign in 2014, where we built probably the largest partisan voter protection effort Texas had ever seen up to that point. where we trained poll watchers to go to the polls and help voters on election day. After that, and after some service in the Obama administration, which ended when a certain president came to office, I was looking for my next thing, and I really wanted to come back to Texas for a variety of reasons, but in part because, this is in many ways ground zero for voting rights in the 21st century. I felt that way in 2014 when I came here, and I feel that way probably even more strongly now. So I started working with TCRP, and our program our voting rights program defends and tries to expand the right to vote in a couple different areas. One, our more traditional thing that we do, that we have done for a very long time, is strategic litigation. So finding what are the not strategic, but what are the structural barriers to voting in the state of Texas that have the most direct impact on preventing people from voting that can be attacked in the courts. And so our big case that we've been known for in recent years is something known as the Stringer case. Under the National Voter Registration Act, also known as the Motor Voter Law, when you go to DPS, to a Department of Motor Vehicles, federal law mandates that you be offered the simultaneous opportunity to register to vote. That law was written in 1993, and since then, the internet has come along. And so now many driver's license departments allow you to do things online that you used to only have to do when you went into the physical office. And so here in Texas, DPS said, well, you can renew your driver's license online or your vehicle registration online, but you can't register to vote when you do that. And we said, no, that's not what federal law says. Even though the federal law was written before the internet, it says if you do a driver's license transaction, you must be offered the opportunity to register to vote at the same time. So we sued over that. We won in the trial court. We're waiting on a ruling in the Court of Appeals, but that's the kind of lawsuit that we do. We also, in recent years, have been pioneering certain campaigns to attack structural barriers to voting through non-litigation means. So I came on board TCRP to run our high school voter registration campaign. In Texas, how many of y'all have heard of the high school voter registration law? Oh, that's good. That's good. It's more than I expected. So in Texas, there is a very unique law that requires every high school in the state, public or private, regardless of size, to offer its eligible students the opportunity to register to vote at least twice each school year. But our research has found that compliance is scattershot and not near a majority of high schools in the state. So, that's a hard thing to litigate over because you could sue, thousands of schools in the state, and schools are popular institutions, so, there's that. So, but what you could do is try to persuade them to do it. So what we did is we created a campaign called Own Our Vote, which brings together over 24 civic engagement groups that register high school students and that work with schools and bring them together to work together to share resources, to divide up the work, and supply them with the resources that they need to register voters. And the reason that's part of our program is that the failure to comply with the law, even if it's just through passivity, we consider to be just as much a structural barrier as active non-compliance. The last thing that we do, which is very relevant to most of what I'm going to talk about tonight, is our nonpartisan election protection program, where we train lawyers, law students, and other members of the community in election law, and we send them to the polls during early vote and on election day, and they can help voters in real time with answering questions that they need to know the information for to go vote. Am I at the right polling place? What kind of ID do I need? Am I even registered to vote? Or I went in there and they won't let me vote. What can be done? And similarly, we run a hotline where anyone in Texas can call in. They can ask us those basic questions for information, or they can report information to us. And so, kind of to set the scene for this legislative session this year, this election was absolutely wild. I mean, I think this is my second election in Texas, and I thought 2014 was going to be the wildest thing I'd ever seen, but it was nothing compared to this. So, number one, the positive is that, people were very much more engaged in voting and elections and candidates at every level of government than anything I've ever seen in my life. And that's good. But there are also just an unbelievable range of problems during the election. So the one that probably got the most attention, which you all may have heard of, was this issue with the voting machines where it seemed to be flipping votes from Beto O'Rourke to Ted Cruz. It was an issue that was very easy to be susceptible to conspiracy thinking, right? There's already a bunch of concerns about the security of our elections, and it was the most high-profile race in the state anyway. And so to hear that people would try to vote one way, and then the person they were probably voting against, the machine was trying to record a vote for, inflamed all kinds of pre-existing fears. But what it actually was is the machines are old. They are basically at least 10-year-old technology using like a spin dial on the early iPods to navigate when that form of technology people have really progressed beyond. And so in part, there is a time lag between what the person operating the machine was thinking was happening and what the machine thought was happening. And so it was, as far as we know, an accident. But you combine the actual problem of voters perhaps accidentally voting for a candidate that they don't want, plus the misinformation, and you have like a real problem. And that was just the most high-profile example of a number of machine breakdowns. The machine technology in many places in Texas is old. It hasn't been, they're just old machines. Like you have a machine after 10 years, it's going to start breaking down. But it hasn't caught up with the way that people use technology. You had incidents outside of polling places. There was, in particular, a couple of early voting sites in Dallas where one side had basically seized all of the territory that you could legally seize to have your volunteers outside the polling place. And they created like a funnel where to get to the polling place, you had to walk through this funnel where it was surrounded by signs. And they were there legally, like they were outside the 100-foot zone, and they weren't doing, with some exceptions, anything overtly hostile. And yet the entire environment was disturbing, And so working through issues like that. Beyond that, the normal election breakdowns that you see in Texas all the time, like people having tried to register in the past, thinking they were registered to vote, and then they don't show up on the rolls. Polling places that didn't open on time, which that happened in Harris County this time, and it happened in enough election cycles that we had all worked in. We were ready to go, and we sued the hell out of them that morning, and we got 9 polling places in Harris County to stay open for an extra hour. So things like that. But there was a broader, universe of things going into this session. There is growing concern over the security of our elections, whether it's cyber attacks, whether it's the machine breakdowns, just not keeping up with technology. There's been a systematic campaign to convince people that there is widespread in-person voter fraud. And it has sunk in with some members of the public who now believe that this is a serious threat that the legislature and law enforcement must take action against. And including a series of selective criminal prosecutions of people for what we believe are largely innocent mistakes by people who didn't know the law, who now wind up in jail. And in that regard, I don't know if you all have heard the name Crystal Mason. She is an African-American woman in Fort Worth. She's a former felon who served some time in prison for, I think, a tax-related issue. She got out of prison, and on supervised release, in the state of Texas, if you're a former felon, you do not regain your right to vote until you've completed all elements of your sentence. It's called being off paper in Texas. So it's not just you're out of prison, but you have to complete supervised release or probation. She was still on supervised release, but she did not know that that made her ineligible to vote. So when the 2016 election comes along, she goes to go vote because that's her civic duty. The election workers let her cast a provisional ballot, which was rejected because she was not a registered voter. And instead of accepting this as just a mistake, the state prosecuted her, and she's now serving a 5-year jail sentence for attempting to cast a vote that wasn't even counted because she is not a trained election lawyer. The one final element going into this session is, it actually happened just after session started, but before session really got going, was a new Secretary of State came to office in Texas. His name is David Whitley. And one of basically the first decision he made was to launch what we consider to be, and what a federal court considered to be, a racist and discriminatory voter purge that basically took data from the Department of Public Safety. And if you had gone to the department within a certain period of time and submitted a document that suggested you were not a citizen at that time, they compared those people with the people on the voter rolls, and where they matched, the secretary sent that information to county election officials for investigation and automatically sent those people to the Attorney General for criminal investigation, and did an inflammatory press release that they had found nearly 100,000 unlawful non-citizens on the voter rolls, which within 48 hours had managed to make its way into a Donald Trump tweet. So we attacked that purge right away. We sued. We won a favorable ruling in court, and in recent weeks, we won a settlement. So that goes into session. And the way that the Texas legislature works, it's been described to me as a giant funnel that intentionally kills as many bills as possible, so that way a very small percentage of bills actually get through. So I think something like 7,000 bills are usually introduced in the state of Texas. Of those, roughly 1,000 tend to pass, or at least I think 1,000 last session is the figure I heard. So as of, I believe as of the start of today, only 4 election-related bills had actually passed the legislature and gone to the governor for signature. And 3 of those are not really controversial at the least. I don't really think any of them are controversial, but 3 are truly, they may be beneficial reforms, but they are small scale. One is that when a county tells the public that a polling location is at a certain address, the county also has to say what the building name is. I kind of like this one. If there is a tie vote in an election, and then they have to do another election to break the tie, the names of candidates on the ballot in the second election have to be in the same order as the first election. One that's really interesting, and this is kind of an example of a law that seems neutral on its face until you know better, and then you're like, oh, that's interesting, is that if in certain elections, I think it's nonpartisan municipal elections, if a candidate who has won the right to be on the ballot dies after the filing deadline but before ballots have been printed, the local election officials can exercise authority to keep the dead person's name off the ballot. So you may think, well, that seems reasonable. Why would you elect a dead person? But keep in mind that in most elections, there's something like 2 or 3 people who represent different ideological viewpoints. And if you do not allow an option for people to essentially vote for the viewpoint that the dead person may have represented, then you may have put your thumb on the scale for the viewpoint of the candidate who just happened to survive until the election. And so a good example of this is the 2000 Senate race in Missouri, which maybe I'm the only one old enough to remember. But so in that race, John Ashcroft was the incumbent senator. He was a Republican running for a second term. It was a closely contested Senate election against, I believe, the governor at the time, Mel Carnahan, the Democrat. Carnahan died very soon before the election, but people voted for the deceased candidate because they didn't want John Ashcroft to win by default. And under Missouri's election laws, the Democratic governor, or I suppose the Democratic governor's replacement, because I believe he had died, he was the one running for office, could appoint the person in the interim, right? The dead person wins, the office becomes vacant when the prior term expired, and is replaced by the person with the same viewpoint as the person who won. So that's an example of kind of a neutral change that may actually have some unintended or perhaps intended consequences. The fourth bill that has passed so far, although I think some number of bills did in fact pass literally today, is actually a cybersecurity bill that had bipartisan support, and it would essentially require the Secretary of State to establish best practices on protecting election data and election security. And it would require the Secretary to offer cybersecurity trainings to county election officials, and would require county election officials, I believe, to take cybersecurity training on an annual basis, which, you know, this is a real issue, and with potentially devastating consequences if the legitimacy of an election were ever called into question because of a cyber attack. So those are the bills that have passed. There are a number of other bills which I can go through quickly, and then I think we can get to the kind of question and answer session. So it's probably easier to start with what we consider to be the very bad bills. The worst of them, how many of y'all have heard of Senate Bill 9? Okay. Senate Bill 9 was the Lieutenant Governor's priority elections bill this legislative session, and it did a number of, or would have done a number of very bad things. Number one, it would have imposed new red tape and burdensome paperwork on the voter assistance process. In Texas, if you are a voter with a disability or you are a non-English speaking voter, you have the right to assistance in marking your ballot. But there are those in the state of Texas who believe that this is being manipulated for fraudulent ends. And so in order to combat what might be a problem on a small scale, it would have imposed all kinds of new forms and red tape on every voter needing that assistance. So for instance, I was explaining to someone right before we started, the original version of the bill would have imposed a requirement on people who provide rides to the polls. If you're a driver and you provided a ride to the poll to someone who needed curbside voting, which is available for people who cannot make it into the polling place, you would have had to sign a form certifying that the voter needed the curbside voting, which is problematic, at least in part, because many Rides to the Polls programs are operated by volunteers who are driving their fellow citizens out of their sense of civic duty and do not personally know the people that they're driving, and so cannot make that certification. But also, like, whenever you add in new paperwork, you add in the potential for people to make an accidental false statement. It takes time to administer these forms. If polling places run out of the forms, then the voter is just SOL until they get new forms, and who knows when that might be, and they're just sitting around waiting. It would also have furthered the criminalization of voting in the state of Texas by boosting penalties from misdemeanors to felony level offenses for things like making a false statement on a voter registration form. Some of my favorite provisions, and I say favorite in quotes just because they're almost laughably over the top. One would have given the government unlimited immunity to commit election-related crimes in the investigation or prosecution of election-related crimes. Now, it's unusual to give the government immunity to break the law in any situation, but like consider the potential for abuse here. It clearly, and they said at the hearing on this is to allow us to conduct undercover sting operations. That way, government agents could commit crimes while doing an undercover sting operation. Now, when I read this, I thought this was a government spying provision, and it probably would have been. That basically they could have sent undercover agents into civic engagement groups that they suspected of committing crimes, or maybe that they just didn't like, and spy on them and see what happens. What they said at the hearing that they wanted to do was to send testers into polling places to try to vote illegally to see if they could. Now, the law had no provision to prevent them from actually casting illegal ballots. So, like, in theory, the government could be like, in some of these close elections in the local level that are decided by 2 or 3 votes, they might be casting the illegal vote that decided the election, and there is no provision to stop them. Another provision in the original version of the bill would have created a new crime of impeding a polling place within 1,000 feet of a polling place. Now, I'm not great with math or measurements, but for those of you who are, 1,000 feet is over 2 football fields. It extends, like if you're a church in a neighborhood, that doesn't just apply on the church, it extends blocks into the neighborhood where you could just be arrested for what does it even mean to impede a polling place? I don't know. Whenever I go vote in a library, there are children running around and they bother me. Like maybe that's impeding a polling place. But you can also see how this is an opening for abuse, right? Because we all have unconscious biases. Some of us have conscious biases. And so you could say that a person from a political group or an ethnic group or a religious group that maybe you don't even know you're biased against. And you're like, boy, that person, I just know they're up to trouble. I'm going to go like harass them and warn them away. Maybe I'll just arrest them. The potential for abuse was just so vast. Senate Bill 9 passed the Senate on April 15th on a party line vote, but it did not make it past a key procedural deadline. Actually, tonight. Tonight is the deadline for it to make it out of the House. It won't because it is not on the calendar. So we're very lucky. And that had a lot to do with the civic activism that a lot of people, perhaps in this room or the groups that you are a part of did, that showed up and protested and made their voices heard. A couple of the other really terrible bills, which I'll run through really quickly. One that's kind of my favorite for its just sheer stupidity is that one bill would have canceled every voter registration in the entire state every 10 years, at the end of year 1 in the decade. So at the end of 2021, I think because it would have been tied to the census or something. Think about that. Like in theory, after that day, there couldn't even be an election because there are no voters, you know? A couple bills that would have attempted to reinstate the David Whitley Purge, which I will explain to you what that is, but a federal court called it ham-handed, an example of the ability of government to intimidate the least powerful among us. And even after that court ruling, there were certain members of the legislature who thought this is a good idea and we're going to keep doing it. One that would have, so in 2017, a law was passed to make it a criminal offense to engage in organized election fraud activity. I sort of, this may not be right, but I sort of think of it as like a RICO for election crimes. But the problem is, like, what is election fraud activity? What is a ballot harvesting organization is the term defined. Who knows? But it established a criminal offense for that. And I guess the government was having such a hard time actually prosecuting these cases, that a bill was introduced this session to create a civil offense of this, which as a civil offense has a dramatically reduced burden of proof, preponderance of the evidence versus beyond a reasonable doubt. So it was essentially a backdoor way to punish criminal conduct that they couldn't, I think, actually get criminal convictions for. And so they're just going to go into civil court, and I think it's $1,000 per violation. So just bankrupt people and intimidate them from participating in their democracy. The last really bad elections bill, which almost made it into SB 9 as well. And this is another example of a bill when you look at it and you're like, well, that probably seems okay until you get what it's trying to do. So in Texas, in some counties, like Travis, there is the county-wide voting center system where you can vote at any polling place on election day that you choose, unlike the precinct-based system where you have to go to your assigned polling place on election day. This bill, HB 3964, would have tied the distribution of county-wide polling places in an area to the number of registered voters in a given area. So the more registered voters you had in a given area, you would have more county-wide voting centers. And that almost seems intuitive, right? The more voters you have in a particular place, why not have more polling places near them? Except that in this country, the right to vote has only been recently established. And because of centuries of discrimination and oppression, the registration rates among non-white voters is not as high. And so what that effectively would have done is close a certain number of polling places in minority neighborhoods and redistribute them into white majority neighborhoods. It's almost certainly a violation of the Voting Rights Act. We raised holy hell about it. At least for now, it was in SB 9, and it hopefully will have died with SB 9. So that's the bad news. The good news is there were every possible election reform that you could have wanted, that we could have wanted, was introduced this session. And so as a roadmap for how to make elections better in Texas, you couldn't do better than a number of these proposed election reforms. So for instance, online voter registration. And it is a myth that some people have in the state of Texas that we have it. We don't. We are one of only, I think, 12 states in the union that don't have online voter registration. Automatic voter registration, where you would be automatically registered anytime you submit your address in a government transaction, or same-day voter registration, which is actually more my favorite, although I like online voter registration too. But basically, you just show up to the polls and you get registered to vote. And like if the voter registration system is electronic and updated constantly, that's accurate. And in fact, there's a state in the union, North Dakota, that doesn't even have voter registration. So, you know, this is a very workable system. And people wouldn't have to worry about what the deadline is. They wouldn't have to worry about government snafus that keep them off the voter registration rolls. They could show up to vote, register, and then vote a few minutes later. There's a bill, I think it's actually still in progress, to create a state fund to pay for election system upgrades, like new voting machines in particular. The state would set up a fund, put money in there, and then local governments could apply for money to fund 50% of election system upgrades. Campus polling places, where if you have a school with a certain number of students, I think in some bills, the university would at least have to have 5,000. I think in another bill is 10,000. But if you have a college of a certain size, they would have to have a polling place at the main campus of the institution. So that way, the college students who live there, many of whom may not have a car, can go vote where they live and work, quote unquote. There's a bill to allow tribal IDs as a form of voter ID, which let me tell you, that was one hell of a hearing, because like you would think that that is like the most common sense kind of reform. And you know, there was unfounded skepticism is the polite way I would say it, even though they represent a sovereignty that was here before, long before the United States was. And then finally, a bill that would have allowed those under 18 to vote in a primary when they would be 18 in the general election. So for instance, if you turn 18 in July 2020, you'll be eligible to vote in the 2020 general election, and so that bill would have allowed you to vote in the 2020 primary here in Texas in March. One other bill, I don't know if it's good or bad or not, and it's actually, I think, very appropriate for a tech audience, is a bill to create a criminal offense for fabricating a deceptive video with intent to influence the outcome of an election. So it creates a criminal offense for creating something called a deep fake video, which I don't even know if that's a technical term of art. Is it? Okay. So, good. A person commits an offense if the person with intent to injure a candidate or influence the result of an election creates a deep fake video and causes the deep fake video to be published or distributed within 30 days of an election. And the latest version of the bill that I found defines a deep fake video as a video created with the intent to deceive that appears to depict a real person performing an action that did not occur in reality. I don't know. It sounds like it has some possible First Amendment issues depending on how it's applied. I guess I would also say people in the legislature do not all seem tech savvy, as maybe the way I would say it. And so I'm not, but like, you know, maybe. So we'll know more in a week when more of these bills get to the finish line, but that's kind of what it looked like. So with that, I guess, should we go into questions?
People have questions? I don't get questions.
Hi, my name's Crispy. I'd like to know if you have an understanding for the mind of the adversary that's doing this.
So I think there are good faith. There are some who have a good faith concern that, and I think it's almost like there are people who believe that there are a group of people somewhere that are cheating the system, right? Like I think you see this in other areas of policy, like, oh, this group of people are getting things that they're not entitled to, right? And I think that this is another, the good faith version of this is another manifestation of this, that there's a group of people trying to cheat the system and we need to crack down on it. And they use the rhetoric of voting is a civil right and my right to have my lawful vote not be diluted by votes of people that do not have the right to vote. That's a civil rights issue just as much as actively disenfranchising a voter. So there's that. But I also think that this is not a new thing, right? Like expressed concerns about the integrity of the voter rolls has been the stated reason for voter suppression since the Civil War. You know, all of those poll taxes and literacy tests and the crazy things that voter registrars would have minorities do to test whether they have the right to vote. They would have probably said, you know, we're just trying to make sure that only lawful voters vote, right? So I think there's an element of some people are genuinely concerned about this, and it's been inflamed by things like what happened in the 2016 election. But I also think there are some people that are motivated by bias against people that they don't think are legitimate voters as much as other people. And I think there's no small amount of political calculation, right? Like you could view these voter suppression bills as an attempt to hold on to power, right? And to change the rules to make sure that you do. And so in that sense, it's a lot like gerrymandering, which is actually another thing I didn't touch on, but there were some good bills to create independent redistricting commissions in the state of Texas. What's that? I don't think it got very far. It might have got, I think it got a hearing.
Hi. Is there a structural change to how voting occurs that could transform this? Like, I know cell phones, and everyone has a cell phone, but something like that where it's just like, if you could mentally know this person's thinking this, that's their vote registered. Is there stuff like that to kind of move closer to a point of making it easier to understand what vote's going on?
Yeah, so I think the biggest issue that keeps people from voting is the registration system, right? It's that people attempt to register and something goes wrong. Whether it's government incompetence or the voter not understanding the rules, right? They register to vote on November 1st, and they don't know that it's way past the deadline. So I think if you updated that system, that would be transformative. So in Texas, right, we have an entirely paper-based system, which forms are liable to get lost. Or, I mean, if you read my handwriting, you'll have no idea what I'm saying, right? And so, like, you type in the voter's name incorrectly, and then they show up to vote, and it doesn't appear that they're on the rolls because the registrar got the name wrong. So I think if you really, like, looked at that system first, I think there's a lot to do in terms of getting information out there. So in Texas, one of the central principles of Texas elections is local control. So we have 254 counties in the state, and they run the elections. And yet, the amount of information that they communicate to voters really varies. And it varies in terms of amount, in terms of quality, like easy to find. And there were actually some bills I think that may yet get through that would, for instance, require counties to inform the Secretary of State when they are holding an election. Particularly for like local elections, the Secretary of State doesn't always know that they're happening within the state. And so there's a lot to be done there in making sure that local governments have that information readily available, particularly on the internet. I mean, in this session, there were bills to actually add requirements that things be posted on the internet because they still hadn't been updated from like the county bulletin board or the largest newspaper in the county, right? So I think those two big things. I would also say a third thing, but it's different, but I think it's important, and I think you can see it happening, is just people actually being engaged on this, right? So especially since 2016, people making the connection between voting and the outcomes that they want in their society, and beginning to learn, like, this is how, like, I can be a poll worker, like, and help administer the election. Even learning those opportunities exist, because ultimately this comes down to how much people are engaged in the system.
What's the likelihood that Texas falls under preclearance?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, under the Voting Rights Act, under the original Voting Rights Act, the localities in the country that had the worst histories of voter suppression fell under preclearance. That essentially there was a formula that calculated what are the areas in the country that had the worst problems in disenfranchising people. And it brought them under preclearance, where any change in election laws had to be approved ahead of time by the Justice Department. And this is one reason why the voter ID law in Texas did not take effect automatically, is that when it was passed in 2011, it did not get through the preclearance process. But then in 2013, in a landmark Supreme Court case called Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court struck down that automatic preclearance by suggesting that, well, it's been enough time since the 1960s, we're past all that. And it would be disrespectful to states to continue to have them fall under preclearance, to be so suspicious toward them, which was absurd to the voting rights community, and you very quickly saw, like, state legislatures in those very same states reimpose these serious voter suppression issues, places like here in Texas, North Carolina, Ohio, Wisconsin, all over the country. So basically now, unless Congress has the option of revising the formula under the Voting Rights Act to take account of the 21st century, is the option the Supreme Court gave them. And that has not really gone anywhere. So the only thing that you could do now to bring localities back under the pre-clearance process is to bail them in. Basically, sue them enough times and create enough of a factual record that they are intentionally discriminating against people that now they are vacuumed into the system. And I don't know, it's been years, still hasn't happened. It'd be nice. I wouldn't put my faith in it because, like, you know, the key to making Texas election systems run better is like citizens being civically engaged and demanding it instead of hoping the courts save us. I was talking about law school earlier, and I don't like litigating, so obviously I would say the courts won't save us, but, like, you know.
You talked a little bit about the registration with your renewing your driver's license and stuff like that earlier. I've seen some like confusion around registration at the DMV and like checking that box and thinking that you are registered or all those different things not going through paperwork. Are there any like attempts to remedy that from the legal perspective, or what is the current like state of registration through the DMV?
Yeah, so it's been a problem for a long time because, and it's not just in Texas, right? Like, I think many state license departments, for some reason, this is a problem for them, that they don't prioritize training their workers on them to see this as a part of customer service, right? Like, your product is not just that you're giving them a driver's license, but that you're also helping them vote. And then there are technology issues, right, of like the data transmission, even from DPS to Secretary of State. I know that those efforts continue. I'm not quite clear on, like, it was clear to me in 2014 that that was a major problem. Like, my impression was that people would vote provisionally, and then the county elections office would have to go to DPS and be like, dude, do you guys have these forms? And then, I don't know, they'd find them in a box somewhere or something. And then those voters would be able to vote. But it's just a continuing management challenge. And actually, that's an interesting thing now that there are these reforms. I think it got passed, right, that like the driver's license department is now actually being split off from DPS into a DMV. So who knows? It's a continuing challenge.
So we saw kind of what happened at San Marcos at Texas State during the last election cycle with polling locations closing a little bit earlier. You kind of touched on what's going through the ledge right now and putting polling locations on campuses, but can you speak a little bit as to what happened there? I think y'all got involved, or somebody got involved and sued and got those polling locations pulled back open, but can you explain that and what's being done to prevent that from happening in the future?
Yeah, so we were the ones. I was not on the litigation team, so I can only speak kind of generally about it. But essentially, we discovered that the campus polling locations, I believe during early vote at that university, were not being kept open as long as they should have. And so that's kind of an example of the strategic litigation, right, where we discovered a flaw that affected a large number of voters that could also send a message to other counties that are operating polling places of what the law is and what their obligations are. So, I mean, I can tell you that came together very quickly, which is part of what we try to do in this program, particularly around elections. Like, there were no real pleadings drafted on the day of the election for the lawsuits in Harris County that we did. Like, we just had to kind of jump on it. And, you know, I think that case like has such symbolic power for reasons that I did not expect at the time, but people still refer back to it. And I think it speaks to the idea that sometimes you think nothing can change, right? That like things are just kind of stuck the way they are. And there was an example where we were able to actually show people that things can change. So yeah, sorry, because I wasn't on the team, I can't speak more generally than that, but.
I have a couple of online questions.
We're online? I guess we are.
Yeah, we're on. Can you talk about how the 2020 census is going to affect future Texas elections?
Yeah, so many of you probably know this already, but the census determines, it's a population count, and from that population, all kinds of districts are drawn. Many people focus on the congressional districts for good reason, because they're so high profile. But the census numbers also determine state legislative districts, districts for local races. And so the citizenship question would, if it's affirmed, put on the census form a question of, are you a US citizen? Which was discontinued after the 1950 census, I think. And the concern is that the population count is everybody who is here. Under the Constitution cares about if you are here, you get counted. And from that, legislative districts are drawn based on the number of people, not the number of citizens or people who are lawfully here. And so with the question on the form, the concern, and I think it's a valid concern, that some large number of people will refrain from filling out the form at all because they're either not here lawfully or they are here lawfully, but they rightfully are suspicious of the government and what it will do with this information. And with that areas with large, particularly non-white populations will get an undercount, and therefore will get fewer representatives in Congress, in the state legislature, or elsewhere than they're entitled to. So, I mean, I guess just off the top of my head, it's more that it will have a result in the people who are elected because the electorate is changing. I guess that I would be concerned that people also will, that it may deepen a sense of powerlessness that people feel about their government, that like literally the government is trying not to count them as a person, and which we have a history of in this country, and that people will view this as just another, and rightfully, as the people in power trying to stay in power. And so that's just the way it is. What's the point of democracy? And I worry about both that the leadership that is elected will not reflect the full range of the community it purports to represent, but it would also deepen mistrust and cynicism in the electoral process itself.
I'm gonna have another online question.
Yeah.
Outside of the obviously failed trying to prevent voter fraud claims, how are elected officials trying to defend obviously discriminatory election laws like SB 9?
So SB 9 was interesting, right? Because it didn't really start as a voter suppression bill. So from what we understand, it emerged from a bipartisan effort to promote election security by mandating a paper audit trail in voting, which is a key cybersecurity issue at the moment, to make sure that you have a paper backup in case like a machine gets hacked. Because if there's no paper record, it's just an empty box, right? And like, who knows what it actually recorded. So there was an attempt to do that, and then when the bill was introduced, it had not only that but all this other junk. And then when the bill was initially sold over the course of its first month, particularly until it passed the Senate, it was reported, even in some news stories, as a bipartisan election security measure because they didn't talk about the literal 4/5 of the rest of the bill that they had added. So there's some cloak and dagger of just like not even pretending that it's there. But they've really tried to co-opt the election security stuff to say, if you believe in election security, which is a real concern, like not just election fraud of people trying to vote when they don't have the right to do so, but the actual integrity of the election system, they've also tried to co-opt it into one big thing of only eligible voters should vote, which is a thing I think we all agree with. But then to say, therefore, we must take disproportionate measures to make sure that not lawful people don't vote, even if that means hundreds of times more lawful voters are disenfranchised than any non-lawful voters are ever prevented from voting.
I've been a fairly regular poll worker and VDR since 2008. And every time I go through the training process, there are significant changes. I mean, total reversals. How does that get through? Is it a county issue or is it a county decision to do that, or does it come down from the state? Where they can or cannot use certain equipment like the tablets to update registration at the poll. So one election we had a copious quantity. Next election, I don't recall seeing them.
So that's a good question. And before I answer that, that reminds me of, you were asking about like structural reforms. Another key part of the system that cries out for reform, that if it were reformed would be significant boost to election systems. So I would say voter registration system, number one, but number two is the poll worker system, because in this state, we rely on people working the polls for one day or for parts of early voting or whatever. And the people that you get to do that and the quality of training and support has a direct impact on whether voters can vote on election day. Whether it is training them on the technology to make sure that they know how the technology works and what to do if it breaks down, to even putting a mindset of you are in customer service, right? Like the voter is the customer. You are there to help customers who have the right to vote. And if you were to fix that, that would also, I think, and it varies from county to county, right? Because it's a county responsibility to administer these elections. So in terms of like how these things change, it's a mix of basically every level of government. So the state, obviously, the state legislature writes the laws. Those change every 2 years. They can sometimes change very significantly, like when the voter ID law is passed. At the moment, there are only those 4 election bills that would have not a great direct effect on that kind of work, but we still have another week. Then you have the administrative process, right, where Secretary of State can write regulations implementing the law, but whenever you write a regulation, you have scope to exercise discretion in how exactly to implement that. Also, county and local governments have a huge role too. So Harris County is moving to a countywide polling place system. They actually did it for the first time just a couple weeks ago in the May elections. That's a huge change, right? Where I don't think this was the case there, but like in theory, you could be using an entirely new e-poll book system that you weren't using before, and you have to be trained on, it's almost like the issues that aren't there anymore, right? Like the voter can go wherever they want, but like whenever you do a new system, you have issues. So it's an interplay between all of those. And so for citizens who are looking to be engaged in the process, there are so many places where you can make a difference. And so, for instance, in the ledge, like you can testify on bills that you're for or against. But that's only 4 months every 2 years. The rest of the time, you can attend county commissioner hearings where they're deciding on polling places. They are deciding whether to adopt an entirely new voting center system, or they are doing any other number of election reforms. And like voters actually speaking out and making their voice heard has a direct impact on that. Oh, and then the other thing is, of course, federal law, right? Which, Congress doesn't really do that much these days, so it may not be as big a factor as it used to be. But for instance, Congress, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 1, which would fundamentally transform the election system in this country. That would have a big impact too.
This is a really dumb question, but when there are these voting law or rights violations and you sue and you win, do the violators get punished? Like, are they publicly shamed? Or like, do they wear a dunce's hat? I guess what I'm asking is, like, what's to prevent them from trying this again?
So it often results in a court order and an injunction that requires them to do something under law, whether it's to not do the thing that they were doing or to do the thing that they are supposed to do. And if they violate that order, they're subject to contempt of court, which can be fines, could be imprisonment. There is a public shaming component in that. So as I mentioned, when the federal court ruled against the David Whitley purge, it said this is a ham-handed attempt, and that led the headlines. Going back to David Whitley, he is also at the moment suffering another consequence, which is in Texas, if you are appointed Secretary of State, you still have to be confirmed by the state Senate, much like you do for an appointed position in Washington. But in Texas, you have to get a 2/3 vote in the state Senate to be confirmed. And enough senators in the Texas Senate have blocked his confirmation because of what he did. And there's still a week to go, but if he is not confirmed in the next week, he will be out of a job. And my organization and a number of other organizations united to jointly call for him not to be confirmed. And, the importance of that, number one, we think he's not fit for the job because the very first thing he did was to try to disenfranchise 100,000 people and also, sick the Attorney General on them. But also, it's important for people to suffer consequences when they misuse the power of government. And I would say that that's probably one thing that's been lacking in the state of Texas. Texas was a leader in voter suppression going back to the Jim Crow era. How many politicians were ever punished for that? And, the David Whitley story may be a story that's changing down here.
No? Oh.
I'll ask a last one. So you've mentioned a few different ways that individuals have been involved in helping others perform their civic duty of voting. Could you list out kind of a summary of those if you have any on the top of your head?
Yeah, so number one, if you would like to be involved in my organization's efforts, we are always looking for volunteers. We do more work around election time, but we're always looking for volunteers to man our nonpartisan hotline that helps voters vote, or to go to the polls on election day or during early vote. So if you'd like to be a part of that, you can email me at james@texascivilrightsproject.org. Yeah, I know. I didn't make it up.
Or sign up for their newsletter.
Yeah, right. So one more time, it's james@texascivilrightsproject.org. You could also go get involved with a grassroots civic engagement organization. So there are great organizations like the League of Women Voters, Common Cause. They advocate on many of the same things, but they each have a different focus, and so you can be a part of that. You can be a poll worker on election day or during early vote, and that is a very powerful way to help voters directly. You can participate in local and state government hearings on bills that are, or policies that are important to you. But, you know, also, I'm nonpartisan at the moment, but like, whatever your political persuasion is, go find a campaign, you know, knock on doors for them, make phone calls for them. That's another way to be civically engaged. And then, you know, obviously the most important one is voting at every opportunity, including, for instance, in November, we have a constitutional election here, and there will be important measures on there. So,
We have another online question.
yeah.
Can you clarify the new penalties for discrepancies on voter registration cards and any other penalties that folks need to be aware of? Were they gone with SB 9 or tucked away under different legislation?
So at the moment, the only bill where that was an issue was SB 9, and right now SB 9 is dead. However, you know, anything can happen until a sine die. The penalties in SB 9, it increased the penalty for a false statement on a voter registration form from, I think it was either a Class A, but I think it was a Class B misdemeanor to a state jail felony. And so it would up it, I believe, from an 18-month maximum jail sentence to a 24-month maximum jail sentence. And I believe the fine would have gone up to $10,000 potentially. The other boost in the criminal offense was for providing assistance to a person who is not eligible for assistance. I don't know. I mean, there must be a point to that, but it's like, oh, I tried to help someone. They didn't actually need the help. You're gonna throw me in jail, is that it? But it would have boosted it from, again, a misdemeanor to a state jail felony, which again had that 2-year maximum jail sentence. And like, think about how easy it is to make a false statement on a voter registration form, right? Like, one example that probably has yet to be litigated is for someone who's transgender who has not gone through a transition, and they put down the gender that they identify with, but that they may not have been biologically born as. That may be a knowingly false statement on the voter registration form, but is that really something we should send someone to jail for 2 years? So.
Is that it? Yeah. Oh, you have a question? I guess that's it. I'll say a couple, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, thank you very much for your interest in this, and I'd love to speak with anyone who has any further questions. So, thank you.
If anybody needs to update their voter registration, if you have moved since you voted in November, if you have changed your name, please come see me or go to that little table at the back, and we will update your voter registration. Thank you so much for being here. This was really interesting and really helpful to me. Thank you all for being here and for supporting Austin Tech Alliance. We really depend on y'all to come to our events and to support us, so thank you for being here. Please eat all of this popcorn because I don't want to put it in my car. And feel free to hang out and talk to James. Thank you. I don't know how to turn this off.